Imagine that you find in your mailbox tomorrow or the next day a package addressed to you. In this package you find that someone has sent you a book written by one of your great-grandparents more than 100 years ago. In this book you find an account of your grandparents' life, including many of the most poignant events, such as births, deaths, marriages, tragedies, and celebrations. I think that in the time it takes to read that book, you would become a lot closer to that ancestor, and those stories and events would likely be carried with you throughout the rest of your life. How long will your influence be felt here on this earth? Is it possible for the things you know and for the person you have become and for your faith and testimony to have an influence many generations after you leave this life? If you are keeping a journal on a regular basis and have written your life story, you could influence many generations for decades after you pass from this earth. Perhaps the number one reason people don't write in a journal is that they think that there isn't anything interesting to write about, and that the repetition in their lives makes for boring reading. If you are writing on a regular basis, it is possible to be boring, but it is not likely from the standpoint of someone reading your journal 100 years from now. Imagine all the changes in technology, living standards, social mores, and attitudes over the last 100 years, and how things are likely to change in the next 100. I don't know what it will be like 100 years from now, but I can tell you that it will be very different from today, and that difference is what will make your journal and life story interesting. As an example, I'm going to relate a few things that I gathered from the journal of my great-grandfather, George Pike. First, a little background about George. He was born in Vermont in 1842, and at the age of 16 moved west to Minnesota with his parents and 4 brothers and 3 sisters. In 1872, George married and settled on a farm 9 miles outside of Rochester, Minnesota. A short while later, 2 of his brothers bought farms immediately adjacent to his and began farming as well. All this is a matter of record. These are things you can find out by searching birth and death records, census records, and other public records of the time. But thankfully, my great-grandfather kept a daily account of his farm operations, and I am sure that to him it was pretty boring and repetitive stuff. I found that the vast majority of his entries addressed 3 things. First was the weather. George made daily notes about temperature, wind direction, rain, snow, hail, fog, frost, and cloud cover. I'm not sure why he kept such good notes on weather. After all, you can't do much about it, but he did keep good notes on it. The second thing he diligently recorded was the money he spent and earned. Because farming was a cyclical business, many things were purchased on credit and paid back at harvest time, so he had to keep track of expenses and settle up, as he called it, in a timely manner. The third thing he kept close track of was the time he worked for others, thrashing or putting up hay or doing other work, and the amount of time others worked to help him do the same. Because labor and farm equipment were limited in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the only way to efficiently farm was to share manpower, farm equipment, and your own labor. As a result, George meticulously kept records of who he helped and when others helped him. While George's account books were meant to track his farm operations, every now and then he sneaks in a comment about his family or neighbors, such as, "Wallace's barn burnt down last night," or "Mrs. Dieter's boy died today." Again, I'm sure that most of the things that George wrote about were boring to him, but to me they tell a very interesting story about his life and that of his family, and what life was like in Minnesota in the late 1800s. I thought it might be instructive for me to tell you some of the things that I learned after reading 30 years of his journals. For example, while I knew they grew most of their own food on the farm, I didn't know that in Minnesota in the 1880s they were able to locally buy oranges, lemons, and raisins that were shipped in throughout the year, and that a person could buy oysters and codfish caught more than 1,000 miles away. I knew that my great-grandfather grew several crops, but I didn't know that he grew so many each year, including wheat, rye, barley, flax, clover, timothy, turnips, potatoes, field corn, sweet corn, popcorn, beets, onions, parsnips, beans, grapes, apples, strawberries, raspberries, and dry beans. I learned from his account that even though they grew most of their own food, they still had to go to town 9 miles each way, in all kinds of weather, in an open buggy or sleigh, every week to sell their eggs and butter, and to get their grain ground into flour or feed for their animals, and to get mail and other necessities. If you've seen old cowboy movies, you have seen runaway horses pulling a buggy or buckboard or stagecoach. I always thought this was like the obligatory car chase scenes we see in current movies. However, it turns out that runaway horses were a common occurrence back then. In one case, my great-grandparents were halfway to town in a buggy when their team got spooked, turned around in the middle of the road, and tipped them both out of the buggy and ran 4 miles back to the barn, leaving my great-grandparents to look for other means to get to town and then back to the farm. In another case, my grandfather watched as a team bolted and ran into a mill pond and both horses drowned. Incidents like those were quite common in his journal. I learned that for several years George was secretary of the Haverhill Anti-Horse Thief Association. This association was formed to search after and apprehend horse thieves, although from the notes that George took of their meetings, it appeared that they spent most of their time having picnics, dances, and otherwise using their meetings as an excuse to get out of the house and away from their wives for a while. George's account also contains information about a hired farmhand by the name of Frank, who burned down his brother's haystack. The culprit let out and wasn't seen for several months. The account suggests that Frank eventually returned and made some restitution, but the details are not recorded. I learned that when one of your neighbors or someone in his family died, you did them a favor by digging their grave, and you dug it regardless of the weather. I learned that when you lived outside of Rochester, Minnesota in the 1880s and called for the doctor, you could get William Mayo, one of the 2 brothers who founded the Mayo Clinic, to make a house call out into the country for $5. It cost an extra $2 to have him take out your tonsils while there, and you could tip him a bushel of apples. I learned that when George had business with a law firm in the late 1880s in Rochester, he could go to Perry Mason. George's cost for a consultation with the namesake of the famous TV personality was $2.65. I learned that a man's wages for a day in the late 1880s was $1.50, and that you could hire a team of horses for $1 a day. Butter was 15 to 20 cents a pound, flour was $2.50 for 100 pounds, and oranges could be had for 30 cents a dozen. While George's journals told me a lot about his work, they told me little about what life was like for the women in the family. Thankfully, a journal survives that his oldest daughter Emma kept when she was 15 and 16 years old, and I was able to get a feel for what her activities were. They included washing clothes, churning butter, mopping floors, sewing clothes, and mending as necessary, making bread, pies, and cakes, milking cows by hand, gathering eggs, feeding the livestock during harvest time, harnessing the horses for occasional trips into town, plowing corn, husking and shelling corn, and when she had the time, reading, singing, and practicing the organ and writing letters. She also visited neighbors to help them with their housework and watch children when the wife was ill. There is one entry in Emma's diary that indicated she and her sister were to go to a neighbor about a mile away to have a visit, but the roads were drifted so deep in snow the horses couldn't find the road, so they walked instead. Through all of Emma's diary and through all of George's accounts, I get the feeling that they thought this was all boring stuff, but they still kept writing. I am sure that whatever we write about will be interesting stuff to our great-grandchildren. The important thing is to keep writing and to write with regularity. While I don't write every day, I do find it useful to write each week. Each week for the last 21 years, I have put together an email that I send out to family members, and I make a paper copy to keep in folders. While an electronic format is good, it's always good to make a paper copy too, as electronic files get lost or destroyed. Occasionally, you should make multiple copies of electronic files and distribute them. I put mine on SD cards and give a copy to my children as means of backing up the files. It's interesting to note that the portion of Malachi chapter 4 verse 6 that refers to turning the hearts of the children to their fathers is often quoted as an injunction for us to do genealogical research for our own ancestors. However, the first part of that verse of shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children gets much less attention. While some have suggested that it means our forefathers are on the other side of the veil hoping for us to do our best, I suggest to you that we have a responsibility to turn our hearts as fathers and mothers, or as potential fathers and mothers, to our children by writing a journal that will touch the hearts of generations that are yet to come. I believe we have an influence through the generations by our writing, in spite of the fact that the vast majority of what we write may seem boring or pointless to us. I also believe that when you start writing about your life and your times, the lives and times of your ancestors become more meaningful, and you'll feel more enthusiastic about knowing them better, and you will become more committed to turning your hearts to your ancestors.